we'll start with agenda changes. I don't know of any agenda changes for the night. Does anyone else have agenda changes?
Depending on how our conversation goes, I might want to say something at the end. You want me to tell you what? I'm going to say now?
Leave a surprise.
Keep me in suspense.
Okay.
I did get some correspondence from Lewis Creek Association just the other day that I wanted to bring up under other business and correspondence about a workshop that they're hosting here in town next month.
All right. Anybody else? Agenda changes? We'll move on to public comments. Unfortunately, nobody in the audience tonight. Can't blame them given the weather lately. So we'll move on to village area design standards.
So at our last meeting, we talked about the next steps with this, and my suggestion was before we dove into actual design standards, like pulling from other communities or inventing them ourselves, to have a clear sense of the outcomes that we're looking for in the village. And I think broadly, everyone is probably on a similar page because the town plan was recently updated and there's a vision expressed in that. But within the context of design standards for development, what kinds of outcomes are we looking for? So I asked you all to give me some ideas on that front. And I thought we could open this agenda item by doing the sticky dot exercise and having everyone put some dots up on these various outcomes to see which ones maybe float to the top and which ones, maybe were one person's good idea, but maybe don't attract a lot of attention from the rest of the commission. So we'll do that. I'll pull the screen up, and they're all taped up on the whiteboard. And once we do that, we can talk a bit about that, and I think we can also, I was hoping we could also talk a little bit about outcomes you all would like to avoid. So I wanted to start with the positives. What are we seeking to achieve? How do we get there? But zoning is also about what we don't want to see and how to best to stop that from happening. So, and those are oftentimes a little easier to identify. So if there are any of those, we could talk about that. And Rolf had sent along some imagery of a couple of actual places with development patterns that he wanted to show. So I thought we could show those on screen and maybe go over a little bit of the village visualization project results from 2012. So with that, I emailed you in the packet everyone's suggestions for positive outcomes. As Maggie mentioned before the cameras rolled, a couple of folks had quite a number of them, Rolf in particular. And I think Rolf's initial message is less about maybe outcomes and more about getting to the specific design standards that we might want to do. So with your permission, Rolf, I would suggest that we just don't do the sticker dot exercise for your first 13, but do it for the last 5 that you sent after that. Are you amenable to that? Okay. So if we do that, we will have 26 outcomes that everyone put forward. And what I'm going to do is give you all 2 of these sticky dot sheets. There are 8, if I'm counting right. Yep, 8 on each. So you have 16 sticky dots to place. There are only 26 outcomes, so you can't put a dot on all of them. You have to pick. And there's no real science to this. This is just kind of fun, and it's a visual way to see what people are thinking. But parameters, you're going to get 2 of these, so you have 16. You don't get to share with your fellow planning commissioners. You can only use your own dots. You can't. You cannot cut them in half. We're all getting the same color. You're all getting the same color. And I want to limit it to no more. You can place no more than 2 of these dots on any one outcome. So you can place 2 on one outcome that, maybe the one you wrote that you think is the most important. You want to put it on that.
You Can't do 5.
but don't do 5 or 8. You know, just 2 of your own. Obviously, there are 8 of you, so you know there may be 16 dots on one that's very popular. But I think that's it for the parameters of the exercise. And you don't have to use all your dots. Okay. So before we go, did anybody who read through these ahead of time have a very sort of, I don't understand that question? Because we could get those out of the way if anybody had one. If not, I'll just pull the screen up. You have a printout of all these, but you can also look at them up on the board and while you're placing your dots. This will take a few minutes, obviously. Any clarifying questions? Did Jeff write one that nobody understood?
Well,
Or
Jeff wrote one that says it's what I don't want, and it's also what I don't want. But so, I mean, you mentioned we're going to talk about what we
yeah,
don't want.
treat
People put them in the positive light,
I'm-
tend to go negative.
I'm good
treat
with that. I'm
treat
not complaining.
treat all of them as if they are outcomes that you want to vote for. And if one is a little bit more, let's avoid this, then you are voting to avoid that.
I guess I want to say something now. This is a great hands-on exercise, and all this information that has been gathered is great information. I feel that we need to keep in mind a broad view over the entire village area, and that we eventually want to distill all of this smaller scale, what I consider smaller scale information, important but at a different level, into some very simple way of illustrating to the town, maybe through this broadcast that we are doing in front of the television, and put something on the board that simplifies to the level of, people will call it dumbing down, but symbols that don't have weight to them in terms of what it looks like or how dense it is, but it are broader. And I think I can help do that with the group. I can't do it by myself. I don't want to do it by myself. That's not appropriate. But my background in planning and the kinds of projects I've worked on have taught me a few things, and I think that would be helpful when we get to that stage. I don't want to do this quickly if there's more to be talked about. I understand the importance of moving things along, but I do think we need to have an overview that we all can agree upon, and pass that along and share that with the town and see how much agreement is out there for our very conceptual picture of the future. So I'll shut up, but I think that will help us in the long run.
Okay. Hey, Andrea. Would you like to participate? No, you want to see what the planning commissioners do? Okay.
I don't think it's fair. If you have cookies, we could like trade our little dots. I have potato
On the
chips.
point that you just mentioned, I know it's something. It's the green dot exercise. I remember it was Shelburne a few years ago at their, in the summer they have their
Town
farmers
fair.
market. Their commission came up and took something like that. Like, here's some general ideas of types and sizes, and just handed out green dots to people walking by, and they, I like that. Oh, I like that. And then they did something similar with people walking by.
Yeah.
So, sort of like that. Yeah.
Where I used to live in Westford, they did a major revision of the zoning and came up with a little bit of like form-based codes light for their small village area, town center. And their planning commission did the same thing at the 4th of July, I think, where they had actual pictures of, do you like this or do you like this? And then they had those tied to some of the design standards that they were talking about. But, you know, most lay people can't read a design standard and see what that means. And so they had pictures, and it was a visual preference exercise. That was kind of fun. It was really fun, actually.
Right, and that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Well, John, I'm always
At a-
looking
at a
for
bigger
new ideas
scale.
for the 4th of July display, so
Yeah.
if you want to help me with that,
Yeah.
I think the photograph idea.
Putting
is-
it out to the
is
town.
great, yeah.
That's important.
And I especially like what you said. I don't want to rush this process at all.
Yeah, I'm responding to you and Dennis both said, no, we're going too fast with this other issue we were dealing with. And I realized, yeah, we should set our time frame based on how we can communicate with the rest of the town. We
Right.
want everybody to understand what we're doing and not be surprised or disappointed later on. I think this we'll be at a stronger place in the end
Right.
if we do that.
I agree.
All right. So here are your dots.
But there's also a concern it could all be developed before we come up with anything.
I don't think that's
No.
gonna happen.
Okay.
I thought we only got
We
two.
got limited water and and sewer
extra one back.
to help us
Oh, 2 sheets.
fill the moat,
Big dots.
Sorry.
pull the drawbridge in.
This or
Okay. That's a lot.
the tropics, honey.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to. I don't have your 5. Is it on here? You had 5 other suggestions. I guess I missed that.
That's why we also have to do,
It's not on
you
mine.
suggested,
But I
was
can get up
pick
and get
out
one.
something and
No, I
complete that, and focus.
All right, there it is. Go ahead.
Where is it?
Yeah, that's.
Right there.
I don't. It must have come out after, and I missed that one.
I just sent it out to Alex last week.
Okay.
I don't think anybody has it.
Oh, okay. Well, I can give it a shot.
We're all crashing in the middle.
So what's up on the whiteboard taped up is the same as the printed copy on the table there. It's a complete list, except without Rolf's initial 13.
And we get
So-
to use 16, so.
You get 16 dots, yep. So if it helps you to have the smaller version in your hand, feel free, but you can read that. I tried to print it large enough.
You are, but. Some of these, we can talk about, we could probably clump some of these together. Not quite similar. I had. Have any votes, Andrea? I mean, some of us can be bribed. No,
Use them all?
No. I think that some are maybe redundant, a little, like Randy sort of said. All good though.
Ralph, the one you had written about the green swath one, do you remember the village visualization, the first one?
Yep.
That had, it was almost like a long, narrow green with a winding. Is that what you had in mind? Sort of that separates that from the from the development?
Yes.
Sort of a green, like,
Kind of a green swath.
yeah. I was picturing like, you know, Woodstock?
How's that to some degree?
Yeah, the
Rutland.
where the library is, and yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
Are you thinking that? Oh,
Yep. Lyme, New Hampshire,
yeah,
bunch of places.
yeah.
What's the town down south, Chester?
Yeah, it has
Has
a
Yeah.
a long, thin
Yeah, exactly.
Green.
part. and-
But on one side, you can still see that there are stores over there.
Oh, yeah, it's open enough, so you
Yeah.
see the stores.
Yeah.
I don't know what goes on in that park. I've not hung out in the town very much. If anything else goes on.
I wouldn't have done that, I swear.
You don't have to use all your dots.
I'm not gonna use all my.
What about, are you doing yours?
Yeah, I did mine.
Oh,
But I didn't miss on.
oh, I see.
Can use as many as you want.
I
So
see.
this is the
But you got,
max.
how many did you get to start?
16.
16. Are you guys gonna talk about this afterwards? Is that what you're gonna do?
Yeah, yeah. Just sort of stare up there and
I suppose just leaving and.
That's it, we're done.
I didn't know if
Can we adjourn?
you're gonna, like,
The Green Dot Town Plan.
Alright, have you used all your notes?
yeah, the idea is we would talk
I'm
about
using them
the
all.
outcomes that they
Oh my
had
gosh.
put
so what
forward.
are the votes for people that have the most dots on them?
Well, all of them really,
Oh.
but just to sort of make sure we recognize the ones where there's a lot of interest, and maybe those would be ones we might spend more time thinking about design standards that could help us get there. last bag, did you unearth any critters from
No.
Costa Rica?
No,
Okay, good.
no scorpions this year, fortunately. Looks like a lot of people are on the same page, choosing the same one. There's a lot of dots.
So, you guys?
Great minds think alike, that's me.
Did you just get back today?
No, Friday morning.
Taking so long, I
Yeah, come back to this, huh?
Yeah. We didn't even.
Yeah, that's the corollary rule that I didn't explain. If you can't remember where you put your dots anymore, then you have to be done. Yeah.
You did
I
not.
know,
You did not.
tell, you know,
Yeah, I
and we
know.
had to come through New York City.
Oh,
and,
yeah, yeah.
So we didn't get home.
Oh,
till
but
like-
Friday is when you came, yeah. Friday was a nice day, though.
Yeah,
Yeah, I drove to New York that day.
did you? But the day before had been.
Yes.
And they offered us, the airline said, oh, you can change your tickets for no charge. So we were like, should we or shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And so we took a chance and we just took, and it was storming when we landed in Burlington in the middle of the night. It
Last
was-
Friday. Oh, really? Yeah. Huh. I certainly didn't expect to see what I saw this morning.
No, me either. Shut What they're saying, maybe another one.
Yeah, I can put it back up. Or not as
Good
bad
for
as
the
Boston.
skiing. No, I know, I have a niece there. She was sending us pictures of it. I don't think I get it back.
Nothing that says.
Beautiful. Wet. Ours. Oh, no.
All right, I'm just gonna do a quick tally. If you have the printout, you want the printout. It's on the table if you don't have it already. It's just the same order, you know, left to right, up, starting up, down, up, down, up, down. So starts with number 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Those are the ones that Rolf put forward. And then goes on from there. 6, 2. Okay. So, again, my intent was not to exclude any ideas about positive outcomes, but rather just use this as a launching point to talk about what the commission as a whole thinks might be the most important outcomes, so that we can focus our efforts on design standards in those arenas. We can also address others. So as I look down, it looks like the maximum vote getter was Jeff's outcome, number 5. In 20 years, I want to walk, drive into a historic, lively, economically viable, diverse, economic town core. with a lot of examples. One that and we need infrastructure, water, sewer, fiber optic internet, et cetera. And this,
How many did that get?
that got 11 votes, 11 sticky dots.
Well, how can that be? There aren't that many of us on the.
You can put 2. That was the rule. You could put up to 2 on each one.
I missed that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we had some that didn't get any, and then that one got 11. We had in the upper echelons we had several that got 8 dots. So another one of Jeff's, number 3 of Jeff's, which reads Route 116 transformed into Hinesburg's Main Street, narrow the traffic, on-street parking, slow it down, to note that you've entered the Hinesburg Town Center and when you've left, even if that means the town takes over a section of 116. Move forward with the secondary West Side Road, however, should not try to recreate a main street. It never works. Other ones that got that many votes, Maggie had 2 on the last page of the write-up. Her first outcome about organic growth and character with varied architectural styles, variation evident in architectural details, inviting front porch, unexpected patterns, no cookie cutter house plans with faux details.
That was 8 also.
That was also 8, as well as Maggie's third one there, energy efficient, built for 2050. Buildings and homes built for efficiency, equipped with heat pumps, solar hot water heaters. Large community solar field building cited for solar game, flat roofs having rooftop solar. But there were several others that got 7 or 6. So Joe Iadenza's had a couple there. Joe's number 2 and number 3 got 7 and 6 dots. Joe's number 2 was village and village growth area residents, where residents live, shop, and work without having to use motorized vehicles. And
7.
that got 7. Yep, 7 dots. His third one got 6 dots. Traffic on Route 116 naturally slows between Seaview Corners and Buck Hill Road based on the built environment, road design, traffic calming, etc.
Which is quite a bit like some of.
Jeff's. Some of the
Yes.
right?
There's a lot of
I
overlaps.
think
when we go
Jeff's
through
number 3 and Joe's number 3 are very similar. Yep. Who else got in this? Which one's got in the 7 or 6 category? Looks like Rolf had Rolf's number 18 on the write up. Got 6 dots. A concerted effort should be formulated to connect open spaces within the village area. Continue to create useful open spaces that relieve a dense development pattern. These spaces,
What was that number?
18.
Your
Yep.
second group that I don't.
These spaces and added walkways and paths should coherently link both created and natural open space. Think of the Olmsted plan for Fenway in Boston and how that plan links open and developed spaces with natural areas.
That was 6 also.
That was 6. Yep. And Maggie, you had 2 others that were in the 6 dot categories. Your number 2, green and welcoming, healthy trees, shading roads and walkways, vegetative landscape buffers, softening the hardscape, small parks and gardens, native trees, pedestrian only footpaths. And your number 4, the concentrated retail block, wanting to have that little slice of Bristol or Virgins with intense retail and commercial areas as a focal point for shoppers and local business. So
many did that get?
those 2 both got
6.
6 dots. And we go on down from there. We had a couple, Jeff had a couple with 5, so did Joe, so did Barbara. So you were up there having to look at all those and put your dots on them, and we just read through some of the top dot getters. Are your brains turning? Do you hear any, like James said, do you hear any commonalities? Anything that feels like it's rising to the top in terms of specifics where they want the village to be when it grows up?
So-
Away from 116, it sounds like. We're not right on it as the bakery is right now.
Well, that was the question I posed in my email to you the other day, was that there is a little bit of a yin and yang, I guess, between the main street that is here in the existing village core, which are buildings right on the street and vibrancy and all of that, and what our regulations currently envision and call for. We do have design standards today, and what we have says that it will look and feel very differently on the northerly portion of 116, where we will not have buildings right close to the 116 or multiple driveway cuts, but we'll have this sort of green buffer on either side. So, what do you think about that?
I mean, that's what I was talking with Rolf about, and what Barbara wrote about in one of your ideas was, you know, a green swath that separates 116 from retail, and that has a path through it and is tastefully planted and whatnot. We talked about Rutland, Woodstock with the long greens, and so that gives a buffer, but it's still, you know, you can still see the store. You could see the stores from 116. But a nice wide, safe buffer for pedestrians.
So does that imply then that those stores that locate there want to be seen from 116, that's how they draw their customers?
You know, I guess I've been thinking about this and thinking about the towns like Bristol, Vergennes, parts of Brandon, where there's just, you know, they also have the main road right through the middle of their town, as we do, and that's where the retail is, and it's on-street parking that helps to slow traffic down. You know, as I think of those towns, it tends to be smaller local retail businesses and restaurants.
So,
And you know, compared to what I had been thinking before, mixed use, spread the commercial throughout the development, and now I'm thinking maybe that's just not feasible.
if one imagined taking the section that exists now in the village of this mixture of housing and office and grocery store and so forth, and it has a certain length, and take that and put that on 116 north of Patrick Brook, the culvert and so forth. Make it on-street parking, choke it down so that traffic doesn't, move fast like some of the other ideas. And put it right on 116.
Put it right on and not have this buffer.
Don't do it from the Bristol Bakery all the way to CVU Corners. Just make a shorter, concentrated piece. And I keep thinking at the corner of Commerce Street, yeah, Bristol Bakery's right on the street, but what if we've talked about looking at Commerce Park differently and bringing residents and other activities in there besides what's in there now? What if that sort of extension of commerce and housing and so forth turned and ran at 90 degrees from 116 and drew people back into that area?
Are you thinking,
Instead of just making this long, I'm concerned about a strip development that looks like Route 7, a little version of, it won't be like Route 7 because of where the main road goes, but
So what's the, I mean, I think in terms of businesses and shoppers. I mean, I think of towns I drive through that are just like Route 7 where you just want to keep driving.
right.
And other towns where it's.
Which part of Route 7 are you referring to?
Yeah, exactly. Need to be more specific.
Do you mean Rutland, or do you mean
Yeah.
Charlotte, or do you
What-
mean
what were you
Shelburne? What are you
thinking
talking
of?
about?
I was thinking of out South Burlington, that kind of intensity of,
Right. As compared to smaller towns where there are really interesting, not chain stores, but really interesting local businesses, and where it's like I want to park and I want to walk around.
and that's what I was thinking, do that in a
concentrated-
distance, in a concentrated
Yeah.
distance,
Yeah.
similar to what we have already.
Right.
And might that work well for all the businesses that locate there, and also not wreck our main street, improve our main street?
Right.
And I agree, Windsor, other towns on Route 7 further south.
But I don't know how that could be done, because in those towns, again, it has occurred organically over a long
Over a
period of
long
years.
time.
The architecture's different, the sizes, the shapes of the stores, it's all varied. And, how could we do that now? Maybe with phasing, but, a developer's just gonna wanna come in and put in a block, standard
Yeah, but that's what the
sizers.
developer wants. What do we want? I think we can at least set out to create language and legal language to describe what we see as a better path development of built environment.
So the other thing I thought back to the village visualization that I was not a big fan of, but one thing I keep returning to was it had this swath of a narrow green along 116 with pathway and benches and whatnot, pedestrian friendly. And then a narrow road with parking along which there's the commercial.
I mean, does it have to be one or the other? Kind of what I was hearing John say, maybe he didn't mean it, maybe I just interpreted it that way, is more or less a taper. You have,
More or less what?
I'll call it a taper. The closer you get to the village, as we know it now, the more, the closer your main commercial buildings are to 116. And
There's consistency, I think, by building that long parkway, park. It doesn't have to be, on the other side, doesn't have to be commercial. It could be the beginning of a residential area. And
Or offices or whatever.
or offices or whatever. And if it were residential, whatever it was, there could be paths that come out of the rest of that development and bring people to that long park along 116, and they would come right down to this concentrated commercial, retail, offices, maybe even some apartments on the upper floors, just a more concentrated set of activities. And that'll really bring a lot to 116 that will help define it as, you're in the village. As you approach the village, it gets more intense.
So what if I change it up a little bit and say, think about what's in I call the older part of our village today on 116. So I would say the area from kind of Mechanicsville Road south towards Lampman's, right past here, right, where you've got a mix of, there's older homes, there's homes that are now office buildings. There are grocery stores that came out, right? Then you go down a little bit further, you've got a couple restaurants there, and then around the bend, you got the school. So I feel like that's Hinesburg to me, right? That's how I see Hinesburg has grown. And I'd like to see that continue on 116, right? So now you go the other way, right? Then you get into sort of where the Giroux's metal fabric shop is, you get down to the car lots, and now you're down to Kenny Drugs, and it's getting a little more, we'll call it strip molly, but it's more commercial oriented. It would be nice to see that more residential, the mix that we always talk about going down through 116. But what I was getting at was, when I look at 116 today, I just see a state road. Like, to try to cross it is a death trap.
Right.
You know what I
Drive on
mean?
it
That's what I mean. It'd
morning
be
and
nice to
evening.
keep Hinesburg, but slow that down. So the residential part of it. So I may live right here, and my store may be right over there, or I may want to cross 116 to go over there. But I have that capability without building for commute. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's kind of how I saw
Right.
it. And I hear what you're saying, and I like that idea. Like, I think of the Bristols and things, how they slow everything down. But it doesn't just need to be commercial. I think we could mix it up and keep the way Hinesburg has kind of been through the years. That's kind of how I saw it. Like, I think it'd be cool if somebody rebuilt the Creamery building, made it into an office building. But I'm crazy like that. But that's kind of what I was envisioning, something along those
I
lines. And
think
that's where you start getting into, you've got retail and different things all spread out throughout the town, and it's about living and walking and going to these different things versus, I'm commuting in because I have to go to, XYZ commercial shop. And you could even have big commercial retailers, but fit in our vision of what it looks like,
All of the commercial that comes here is going to be decided by people who feel this is a good place to do business.
Yeah. So that's always been the desire for the supply demand, right? I want to come into
Right.
the town, and who dictates that? In my world, and maybe I'm wrong, is if you let developers do what they're going to do now, they'll do what they do to maximize profit, and you'll end up with a cookie cutter neighborhood. Versus, let's do something unique that people want to live there, and if people want to live there, that drives it up, and then people are going to want to put commercial there, and they'll be more willing to fit into our mold if the desire's there. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I've always said for years, that we need to narrow the road, I guess, with parking beside the road. That's my first suggestion. That would slow traffic down. And maybe like have curbs so that things are separated, a little bit. I mean, that will make it look more like a village. I mean, I think just a little bit that's been done, the parking that's up by Twice as Nice is really nice in there. I really think that if we could have parking beside the road, that would slow things down and narrow, because the road is too very wide. It's difficult to cross. But
Rolf had some sketches that you put online, you probably don't remember this.
That showed a cross-section of a village street with, I think the sequence was sidewalks and then a decent green area that could be planted.
sure,
And then the road, and then I think even a center island of enough size so that it's a refuge to
right.
go across a
yeah.
busy road, plus an opportunity to bring plant material in. All of that adds up, and I don't know what our right-of-way is. It seems like the right-of-way that comes through the village now might not accommodate all of that, but some similarities.
I think you could slow the traffic down between the parking on the road. It could just be, you've got trees that are a little, the green
Yeah.
part you're talking about, closer to the road,
Bring
makes you
some
feel like it's
stuff.
more compact and
Yes.
you'll slow down.
Yeah.
Versus this, like you're saying, there's no curbs, there's no anything. It's just,
No,
burn on through. So, yeah.
I don't know about the rest of you. The traffic's a bit of a mystery to me. I don't really know. I certainly am no expert in it. There's a side to me that sort of says, well, like right now, the congestion seems to all start, right out here, both day and night, or morning and night. Let me put it that way.
Twice a day.
And you wonder if, like Jeff and some of you are suggesting, if in fact the motion is just sort of a lot slower from the CVU Road all the way to Buck Hill, but consistent, i.e. some of the slowing patterns you're talking about. Would that then, to a degree, alleviate some of the actual coagulation of that traffic, or would it make it worse? I don't really have the answer. There's another side to me that also says, I think this traffic business and car ownership business and other stuff is just going to change dramatically in the next few decades.
Right.
To the point where I don't think we're going to have the kind of vehicular intensity that we've had. I just think, for the most part, the way in which all of us behave with our cars is really, when you think about it, the privacy is kind of nice, I guess, if you need it. But most of that kind of movement and being singularly responsible for this, chunk of stuff is a pain, whether it's the maintenance, whether it's sort of figuring out where to park when you get there, or, and I think we're going to start looking for more collaborative ways of moving about. Not to mention other patterns that you all are talking about, which is, Joe mentioned, a lot more places to work and function in the village itself. But I do think what Jeff's alluding to, and Maggie, several people said it, I don't think this kind of dispersal of commercial activity is something that's going to work. I look now at the Black Rock plan, say, for example, and they've kind of, I think somewhat at the town's behest, moved a lot of the sort of commercial stuff, and it's kind of scattered within the development, and we call that mixed use and so forth. But I think it's much more, it doesn't need to look like Bristol necessarily, but if you took some of the patterns that we have in the village already, we used to have the post office close to Lampman's. We used to have
Gas station in front of Lampman's.
And even, not everybody likes the sort of physical form of it, but, the concentration of, the drugstore and the Bristol Bakery and some of the stuff that sits above it. It's really that kind of concentration. I think, Maggie, you mentioned that in one of your points, and I really think that does need to happen in some form. And whether it's
on
off of
116 or
well, I have a different view about this 116 business, and I really do think that a kind of a broader approach to the street that does sort of soften the edges a little bit, like Barbara talked about too. That, in my mind, that's the answer, and I've always sort of staunchly believed that. I don't think propagating the Kinney drug thing all the way to the corner of Seaview Road is the way to do it. I think it needs to sort of take on a different form, but it still needs to be associated with 116. I don't think putting commercial or retail spaces in these back neighborhoods in either direction is really going to work particularly well, because we're also trying to encourage everybody to walk to everything, So
One side of me sees where you're going with that. On the other side, I think of organic communities from 100 years ago, and there was commercial intermixed with residential. It wasn't, there might have been a denser area in one part of a village or town, but it wasn't exclusive.
Well, I think, you go to a neighborhood, say, for example, like neighborhoods in Burlington, and many of them have sort of little commercial enterprises.
At the corners.
But they also
At the
have a
corners.
population to support it. And think about, we walk around the Finney Crossing and the other developments up there, and that's a very dense area, but they still couldn't support,
Right.
they were not at a point where they could support any businesses there, maybe a couple of token ones closer to 2A, but that's why, I love the idea of ground floors of buildings, maybe apartments, being flexible, that they could go back and forth the way, houses in the village go back and forth, office, retail, residential, back to office. Having that kind of flexibility. But there's also a lot to be said for having the retail concentrated, because how often have you stopped in at Kinney's and then gone over for a cup of coffee at the bakery? And, well, long as I'm there, I'll...
Road to the hardware store, for that matter.
Yeah, or long as you're there, stop in at the Blue Cottage
Yeah.
or whatever. It's if these are too far separated, if stores are, then, well, here I am at Kinney's, but do I really want to walk over there? What if I get something heavy? I'll drive over there. And if, that's what I worry about, that driving, Lampman's to hardware to, so that, anyway, I appreciate
think that's
that.
very legitimate to think about that. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of Williston on 2A, all the commercial things they have there, which I find personally rather hideous. How do we avoid something like that? By consolidating all the commercial. So what you're suggesting of mixed use, the residential, the office, commercial, might make more sense. And then Williston also has, their village is totally separate from the commercial. We can't do that, I don't think, because where we are.
I also, and I got these points across a little late, but I also think that there's still some real opportunities. I mean, the land is precious. I mean, you see how the general public of Hinesburg reacted to the kind of intense growth that was, well, that village visualization thing was really sort of us playing out what could happen, with some good elements and I think some bad. But, of even more import to me would be, using the land we've got before we start, migrating to the hinterland, because it's easy to do, there's nothing there. And I'll look at that stretch from the canal to Aubuchon's hardware store right there, much of which is vacant land, really, or underutilized buildings, or... And, if you think about a place where there ought to be some concentrated, active, and pleasing retail and other kinds of activity, that's like about 3 missing teeth, right there. And yet we're talking about, stretching things out up north, and yet, you need to have a willing landowner and other such things for sure. But that's really a place where, it's just kind of, tertiary use in my mind. And even Aubuchon's, I mean, some of what we're talking about, much as I would hate to admit it, the physical form of that thing, I've always called it sort of a 20-year building. But, in point of fact, it embodies some of what we're talking about, which is like, hey, you can go to the liquor store and get some Chinese food and pick up a couple of screws at the same time, without necessarily getting back in your car. And
Think of all of that rearranged so that there's
exactly,
L-shaped
exactly.
building that's along the street
Inverted.
front,
Yeah.
and it's 3 stories high,
Yeah.
and there's apartments up above and a couple of offices
Sure.
and the Chinese and liquor store, and
No,
and the
there's
parking is
that chunk to me is a
accessible.
pretty important piece of property from the canal
Absolutely.
to Commerce Street.
Right.
And even other things like the mobile station, it's relatively new. It's hard to imagine it being, but, what a poor use of real estate, really.
The storage areas.
There's an awful lot of, the Commerce Park all by itself is, a development opportunity.
Right. There are some pieces you'd leave the bank.
Okay.
Well, people, I mean,
And-
the one
and
thing
the
I
vet.
just have to say is like, I think you really need to look at where our economy's going. And, where the whole role of retail is and, and what's the population that you would want to, that you would need to increase any amount of commercial growth
Right.
going up there, so,
Right.
I mean,
I could see the future of the veterinarian where they would send a drone out to your place and you'd put your cat in this little box and fly over to the vet place and fix it up and send it back home.
Anyone
have to
already thinking
drive-
about
you
this
wouldn't have-
vegetable delivery, you know, it's
They
gonna
would
be
have- They could
revolutionized.
send a cat and several pounds of potatoes and, you know, a
Takes
latte.
a potato and, you know.
Probably.
Wait, somebody can deliver me my liquor by a drone? Cool.
Yeah,
Could it,
it'll happen.
Alex, is it appropriate to show some of those little images I sent you today?
well, I just want to make one other comment, which didn't get a lot of stickers
Green
on
dots?
it, but I think that, you know, when, which was Rolf's about number 16, revere our natural resources and integrate these areas. And I think when you're thinking about 116 from Patrick Brook North, is that you've got really varied topography there. And most of the places that people are referring to are flat places. And to me, one of the, ways in which we can distinguish ourselves, because we're not going to create a 19th century village, and we do want to protect our natural systems. And the Patrick Brook is a natural divide. And then the land starts to go up and you've got the crest of the hill, and that whatever kind of development happens, you want to reinforce that kind of topography so that, and the fact that we've got this natural barrier of Patrick Brook, which at some point that culvert is going to need to be replaced, and it could be replaced with a bridge, so that you are creating these physical demarcations, enhancing what our natural topography is with whatever we do with our built environment. But I think, and that's why the connectedness between where Kinney is now and what potentially could happen on the north side of Patrick Brook is a little, I think you need to think about that a lot, because you want to leave enough of a buffer around Patrick Brook that it's not just a leftover space. And by taking that as the east-west, and then the idea of having a green corridor going north-south, you're really making that and utilizing the green infrastructure, the opportunity to really use that for protecting water resources, and then defining the an alternative village behind it, and because you're talking about design standards, and that's getting down to real specifics, which I think John was saying was maybe a little too early, but I think in terms of thinking about the expansion, think about the difference in the topography between there and what our village is, and why we're not, we just don't have the same, flats or the soils, and it's, there's bedrock all the way through the village here, and so we do have some hills here, but it gets much more exaggerated. So that would be what I would see is trying to hide, making the kind of the design priority north of the village be that natural, and then commercial stuff. And I think the whole idea of mixed use, I think, is more in terms of what you guys just were talking about, is the need for commercial, small commercial on the ground floor, and then residential. And I think that's what does work over by Kinney, and that Commerce Street is like dead at night, and that's what's, so just by trying to incorporate a little bit of apartments as Commerce Street gets redeveloped, or could be redeveloped, and getting some housing in there, but keeping that, and that's an easy walk, in that area. When I think about walking up,
People walk it all the time.
but when I think about walking up 116, even if it's a park, it's going to be that you're going to go for a stroll.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if there's residential next in there. No, I mean, it becomes the nearby park.
Yeah.
I was surprised. I was looking at some of the application documents for BlackRock's development, and they have one entitled Existing Conditions. And it has topo shown on it, and it has the property lines shown quite clearly. And it doesn't say anything about the soil types, what's below the ground, and what they might be useful for. We've got concerns about stormwater. It doesn't say these areas are reservoirs for stormwater. That's an existing condition. It's already there. You know, it looks like that. Below graded does certain things. Above graded can grow certain things. To me, that's existing conditions. That's what's there now. That's existing conditions. None of the property lines are anything other than a legal definition. It's not a physical existing condition. And that's, I think, where we begin to decide what happens in here. What happens in this area? And that applies to all the other areas in the village. What are the existing conditions? Some places, the existing conditions include a sewer and water system that has a lot of value. And so that's important. So it's not just natural condition, it's existing conditions, but it includes the whole range from natural to built.
Ralph, do you want me to show something now, or?
Well, I was just, some of these were just little photos of,
Let's have a show.
you know, mostly developed villages or towns or even some small cities. So it was kind of, I don't know, it was interesting to me. I don't know if it would be to you.
I would love to see some pictures.
Do you want to say something, James, before we
please.
dive into picture land?
I guess I've just been thinking about the types of small villages that I like, and I guess those are like several mentioned, Bristol, Virgins, Brandon, and they are kind of consolidated with retail on the first story, and they're all multi-story. They all have on-street parking, and it sounds like, you know, I was trying to imagine that going north of, just because I was thinking, I was just thinking, okay, well, we've got stuff that's not really quite that, but we don't have anything in north of Patrick Brook. So I was imagining it going there, but that doesn't, it just, that seems like it would draw the village out too much. And maybe the better place for that is, like Andrew was saying, like between Patrick Brook and, you know, Patrick Brook back to Mechanicsville Road and some down Commerce Street. And then maybe that means having green buffers north of Patrick Brook. I guess I also was thinking about, I feel like I'd like to see more commercial and light industrial development, I think then is, I've seen in the proposals. So, you know, not, I'd like to see that us write regulations that encourage or require more of that. And I was thinking about Middlebury, and they have Exchange Street, and so that's a road set back from the main road, and I think, you know, there's very relatively pleasant light industrial buildings there. So I was, you know, kind of imagining that back up near Energy, back toward, you know, in the kind of in the direction of the Bissonnette Fields. But I like the idea of maybe shooting for our condensed commercial mixed with residential above, kind of where our village already is, like Mobile, Patrick Brook back, toward the public house area.
Yeah, it does beg the question. So the contradiction I was trying to highlight in the email between what Barbara was saying and what Jeff was saying is still evident a little bit. You know, I think, Jeff, you were advocating, hey, as we go north, let's have it look like this, where buildings come close, you have on-street parking. And some of these other comments are, well, let's do that more, you know, in the core and allow the northern area to have these green buffers and not have on-street parking and not have stuff close to the road. The question that's begged is, that James is the first one I've heard talk about is, if we do that, if we really try to focus on the redevelopment and infill of the area between Commerce Street and Mechanicsville Road, especially on that east side of 116, and then reinvigorate Commerce Street itself, you know, that whole sort of network on those two adjacent streets. And you want that to be mixed use, so you want there to be residential, but you also want, you know, multi-story and commercial. What uses do you envision for the Village Northwest District, which was, right now, is envisioned to be a mixed-use district like the Village Core, with retail and office and light industrial and residential and all that stuff? Do you still envision that for the Village Northwest? Or James is the first person I've heard who said, well, actually, I think we could do more light industrial up there, you know, in mixed maybe with some residential, kind of like the Village Northeast District where NRG is located, which is zoned to be a non-retail, residential, live-to-work, light industrial district. So does anybody have a sense of if our focus is very much recentering on, you know, the existing core, what do you see the Village Northwest District and the Village Northeast District sort of being? Is it just a big neighborhood with a factory next to it, or
It stays very similar to what it is.
just an agricultural field?
Yeah, part of it.
And the Village Northeast District as well?
Well, particularly the Village North. Not as much. I see the light industrial more in that location, given that there's wetland down at the bottom. I'm not sure about.
Yeah, you can't do a
building
whole
in
lot
there.
down
You
there.
can't do a great deal there, but I have a problem with it going over on the west side also. And in fact, can't we redefine light industrial to be light agricultural industrial? So that there are some greenhouses there, so that there is some food processing there, so it takes advantage of the better soil that's along this side, and there's water coming down through there. That's what's in my head about how that might be used, how that area might be used. I hate it when somebody looks at a farm field and says, there's nothing happening out there, there's just some cows out there, you know, and we should develop that area.
Well, I mean, I hear you in general, right? But when the board considered, you know, these two new districts, they did it for a specific reason, right? They did it because there were services here, right? The village could take the extra growth. At the time, we thought we had sewer. I hope we have sewer again someday, right? We had water. I think we're going to have water again in a not too distant future, right? If you want things like people driving less, if you want more services, you know, in town, if you want more pedestrian use, then you have to encourage the density somewhere. And if you don't do that, right, this wasn't a reason why Village Northeast and Village Northwest were put together, but there's a natural consequence here, right? If you want to keep areas closer to an existing village, you know, totally open, take them back to agricultural use, the pressure will move elsewhere in order to, you know, satisfy the need for businesses and housing and et cetera.
I am aware of why we ended up defining the village northeast and the village northwest, and I agree with the concept of keeping the development concentrated so that it doesn't spread out all over the 36 square miles of Hinesburg. My tendency would be to make it more dense in less ground area and leave places for stormwater, leave places for agricultural use right here.
Right, stormwater is not a question because anybody developing, right, has to deal with stormwater. There are fairly tight regulations on that. They don't get away with it. All right. Agricultural, I mean, all right, you're making an argument on best use of that particular land. Right. But it competes with where the services are, which is why we wanted a village northwest and a village northeast.
Agriculture needs water, needs sewer.
No, agriculture does not need sewer. Plants
Not
don't
the-
crap a lot.
Not the kind that, but they need water. They might not need sewer as much, but they do need water to function.
They don't need municipal water. Right? If you're arguing about canning or something like that, okay, you need water.
Food processing, yes. Hydroponic, some amount of water. There's other reasons besides whether or not there are utilities available to decide to use an area less intensely than residential or commercial activities. I think there are other factors that we need to think about before we say just because the utilities are there. I mean, the road is there too. That's an important infrastructure. And I don't think we're deciding to build all along the roads because they're right there and we should use them. That would just be strip development, residential strip development everywhere, which exists. You go down Silver Street and it's house, 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 and sometimes it's more intense, house, 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 and then spreads out some.
There's something about green space and the density that I would rather see, and maybe we're getting into talking about phasing as well, but I would prefer to see, dense clusters or dense development emanating from where it already exists. And I'm thinking specifically Village Northwest, with a lot of green space. I would rather see that than, Butler's Farms or that type of development of.
Common green space then?
Yeah, I mean, it's zoned for a certain amount of density, so I would rather see building up closer to where we already, and you've talked about this, Joe, rather than just cover every square foot with single-family homes.
Right. I mean, the single-family home Butler Farms thing was never the vision, right? We did want higher density. We wanted more of a village streetscape, a village area than we wanted suburbia, right? Butler Farms is a classic suburbia. Big homes, fairly big lots, middle density to low density, just blah.
Blah, yeah.
Maggie, are you picturing, from what you're saying, I think, maybe I'm picturing a cluster of houses and then green space and another cluster of
No,
development?
it's what it's what Joe has been talking about all along is, I don't know, I guess I'm thinking as well at a point where we weren't sure whether there would be the infrastructure to support the density that we are,
That's the phasing
that we have.
side
Yeah, that's the phasing side of it, but to build green space into that, and I wonder if we've done that to the extent that.
Well, my simple answer to that is no. I mean, beyond density numbers, right? Beyond the statement that it's mixed use, beyond the notion that we want a West Side Road, right? This whole area remains really unplanned, at least in our mind, and in a developer's mind, it's been planned.
Well, and
once
all
or
the
twice or
developers
three
have
times.
done the single-family home thing.
Right. So, I mean, if you, and we've incentivized things like open space, but we haven't dictated it, right? In terms of, yes, that will be the incentive you use, or how much area I want, or where that area is, or how it relates to, everything, right? To me, that's a larger vision of this area, which I thought was one of the things that, we wanted to talk about and put more of the town's vision into this area, right, than presently exists. Right. So I would think we really want to discuss and put more down, not only on the scale of buildings, multi-story, et cetera, more prescriptive decisions on amount of green space. Certainly, whether there's green space right against 116 would be one of those decisions. If so, how wide it is. Basically, just that next level of vision to try and guide people. It may even go as far in we're 9 people here, as far as saying, okay, I want this much residential, and I'm willing to tolerate or maybe not tolerate, this much single family versus this much multifamily, and maybe I want, maybe in my commercial areas, maybe I want to make sure that I have at least 60% commercial against like my primary roads. Let's say we do this linear park thing, right? And we put the road next to it, right? Well, okay, that first facing road that abuts 116 is an important road, right? Do I want that 100%? Do I want to allow that to be 100% apartments, or do I want to allow it to be like 50% apartments and 50% single, first floor retail, right? And in second, third story, office or apartment, or is there some other mix? And do I want that sort of thing to be 1 road or 2 rows back as well? Or do I want to, change the mix? It all depends on how prescriptive we want to make this vision.
I think we can go a little further than we have so far.
Well, we
About
really
those
haven't gone that
elements.
far.
No,
So-
we haven't.
So I like what we're talking about, but I just want to make a clarifying statement on the 116 that people put up there. So my thinking around that was the main driver is I was afraid we were getting away from focusing on 116 and just kind of giving up on it, saying, well, 116 is what it is. We're just going to make traffic better. So we're going to go build this West Side Road, and that's going to be our main street. And I guess my point was that's very hard to do. To recreate a main street. I mean, 116 is our main thoroughfare in town. So I wanted us, and I didn't want it to become this big dividing road where now you've got east and west through our village. So I wanted us to focus on how do you get 116 incorporated better into the village. So that's why I was kind of focus on 116, make that a central part of this, because otherwise If we don't, and we're just like, you know, I'm going to put some traffic things in so people can just burn through, and it almost becomes like an interstate right in the middle of your village. You know what I mean? Where it's all about just driving through and hope somebody turns off to go over to our West Side Road. And that's where I was going with that 116 conversation.
That's definitely the opposite of what we wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I was thinking about through this, you know, I like the Bristol vision, right? Trying to create that organically, you know, in 2018, and kind of looking at the Williston experience, really difficult. What I had sort of a vision was, okay, let's go the linear park thing. I'm not sure if I'm up for 100 feet. That's an awful lot of land area. But, you know, if you took a 116 and you took the traffic calming methods, the roadside parking sort of thing, right? Put that up against the green space, right? And then right against that green space on the other side, you can have the east side road, all right, with perhaps, you know, probably some parking along that road as well, and then, you know, a more heavily commercial office space, so that, okay, you know, somebody maybe they don't have to go into this this area to in park if they want to use a business on a nice sunny day, right? Maybe they want to park right along 116. Right, where we've given them space and they can walk across this, you know, green area of 50 feet or whatever it is, right, and then cross a much calmer road to businesses or something like that. You can have parking against the street without having, you know, commercial establishments right in the face on that sidewalk, and I think it would slow it. The trees that everybody's mentioned, that's going to slow it. Right.
Yeah. So when I think of Bristol, I mean, yeah, okay, architecturally it's nice and everything, but I don't think we can recreate that.
No.
I don't think that is Hinesburg, and I don't think us trying to recreate that very tight storefront kind of 1800s look is something we could pull off. But when I think of Bristol, what I like about it is you've got the main road. You enter that town and you see people walking. Maybe it goes to your point about having stores and shops near each other. But whenever you go through that town, you see people on the sidewalks. You see people maybe going to that little park and play area, and then they're going over here. That's kind of what I was meant, is you get that lively village feel, yet you've got a major state road going right through it. You know, that's by Bristol what I mean, or even Virgins to a bit of a point.
Right. So there's two things, right, that are necessary to create that. Some environment that people want to walk in, right, and a place to actually walk to, right. So you got to provide both of those.
Right.
All this development that we have already, we've all recognized has grown up over a couple of centuries. There wasn't traffic like now back then.
Right.
And we've got this big road right through the middle of our town. Virgins, you've spent any time in Virgins, you know how much traffic, large trucks hauling lumber, gas, milk, right through town.
Well, and yet it's a vibrant town, just like Bristol.
It's a vibrating town when you're sitting there and the trucks go past. And I mean,
But we need to address it, right? It needs to be talked about. We need to figure that out. And I think just
I don't see 116, we're talking about 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I don't see 116 changing that much in terms of the volume of traffic and the vehicles. I agree with what Rolf is saying. Vehicles are changing, but we still have large vehicles and small vehicles, and the large vehicles are doing a totally different job. I don't see that going away, given the development that exists up and down on 116 from Burlington to Middlebury.
So let's say 20 years from now, there's half the retail stores that there are today because people buy online.
Right.
Or people work from their home because
Right.
they've got fiber and the internet connectivity, they don't have to drive to an office building. They can work from home, live in home, and your life is shrunk. You know what I mean? You don't even commute to Burlington to work. You can live and work right here. So what does that look? I mean, is that where we're headed? And then what does that look?
Well, I'd love to have
You know?
that happen. I'd love to have more than 30% jobs in this town.
Right.
Good quality jobs that people chose to come and raise their families and be in this area.
I just think you
But-
see more people working from their homes.
E-
unless,
Even that, but nonetheless, there is a gravel pit south of town. And
A lot of
I-
comments.
and there are lumber vehicles that pass through here. There are large vehicles.
Yeah.
Okay, so what should we do then? Should we just leave
I
it and
think
let it
slow
go?
them. I think slow them down is the thing. The only thing we can do. We can't reroute them. West Side Highway, whatever.
Yeah,
No,
right.
that's
Okay.
not in the cards. I don't think. So slowing them down is our choice, I think. And all these things we've talked about, trees, change the road configuration. North of Patrick Brook, we could do a road that's got a divided section in the middle and parks on both sides, and there's open space not built on that we could do that. And then it gets narrow when we get down into this part, and we continue to make it seem narrow. I mean, I have an image of a roundabout where the drive out of NRG comes, reconfiguring the ownership pattern on the other side so that was
Is that snow coming off the roof?
right.
Yeah.
So there's a big roundabout, and we get two roads coming into it, one going into NRG and whatever happens there, another one going into the west side and whatever happens there. And you go around that roundabout, you're getting into something different. And then we build a really cool bridge over it that pedestrians and bicycles can move back and forth. And then we say entering Hinesburg on it. I mean, you want to make a statement, make a gateway.
Yep.
The
Yeah.
village of
Village of Hinesburg, right. The roundabout could have our statues in it, all of us, in a group, sitting around a table.
No, thanks.
I want to see Rolf's visual aids.
I don't think pedestrian bridges over large streets are really, they're actually not pedestrian friendly or community friendly.
No, you
I've
make
s-
them a place to go. You go
I-
up there and sit and watch traffic, and you hang out. And there's some little shops, and there's a place selling, sushi and stuff. No, I
On the
mean,
bridge?
come on the bridge.
How about food trucks on the bridge?
No, small things. James's cards that
This ain't London Bridge. I mean,
when you look at the history of the bridges in England, that's what they did. They were gathering places, not in England, in Paris.
Here you go, Ralph. This thing is a little, it's losing its shine, but it still works. Just
This red thing?
press the red
That little
button.
red thing?
Yep.
Maybe not.
It's about as, look up at the words on the top, file, edit, view window. It's in focus. It's just, the image itself is a little fuzzy.
Do you change it or do I?
I change it. You can point at it with that.
Maybe go back to that. Come back to that one a little bit.
All right, we'll come back to that one. Here's the next one.
All right. So some of what we've just been talking about is really, in my mind, still, and this is a newer body in some ways. This Planning Commission. There's still a tremendous amount of ambivalence about the development of the entire Northwest Quadrant. Both for its natural attributes and its You know, I know that when I first came to this town, and you got to that intersection, the bank was just being built, and you kind of looked to the southwest, and that was, I'll tell you, one heck of a view across those meadows, and to a large degree it still is. I mean, the health facility sits there, and it kind of rambled around, and then you got to Howard Riggs's house, and you know, not being nostalgic, but I think a lot of people in this community have had, you know, very mixed emotions about all this discussion about, you know, the development of that zone. You know, I was probably one of those that said, okay, when it happened, i.e. that whole area was rezoned, this is where we were going to grow, and on the northeast quadrant as well. Okay, how do we do that, and how do we, if it is going to do that, if it is going to become a place that we develop, how does that happen as well as it possibly can? I guess that was my sort of state of mind 10 years ago or something like that, when Jeff and I were still on the village steering committee. And out of that came that little what do you call it, that bomb. Visioning thing. Yeah, John calls it a bomb, but I thought there was a lot of merit to it. I think sometimes, you know, things get sort of blanketly criticized, but they still have some merit to them, I think. And I think actually that plan had some virtues. But anyway, this is more just, this was sort of, before tonight at least, some visual images that I thought were kind of interesting in relation to thinking about how you come into Hinesburg and what does 116 become, and what are some of the potential variables. Now, this is a pretty big town. This is Keene, New Hampshire. But it's kind of fascinating if you look at the main street. I mean, this is actually 2 lanes on this side and 2 lanes on this side, with a green center strip down the middle, and in fact, a fair amount of angled parking on this side of the street, and to a lesser degree, I mean, on this side of the street as well. You can see the blocks sort of grown somewhat organically. The street must skip around here, either that I'm being blinded by the trees, but they even park into that median a little bit. So there's a fair amount of separation from the pedestrians on either sides of the street. This is definitely sort of a fairly intense urban commercial block, I guess you could say. And then it has as its sort of little crown at the end. I don't even know exactly what some of these structures are here, but I think they're somewhat municipal in nature. And sort of an interesting street configuration. You feel quite protected, I'd say, as a pedestrian, sort of, you know, hunkering along those buildings, and yet still a fairly nice. I think one of the things that hasn't quite matured yet with Kinney's and the drugs and the bakery is there's really no substantial, I think its relationship to the street is pretty good, but there's no real substantial green buffer that makes you feel like you're not in the middle of the road sometimes when you're on the sidewalk there, and I think that's really not as pleasant as it could be. So anyway, this was sort of interesting to me. You know, obviously connotes a sort of wider street to begin with in order to handle all that stuff.
Do you think it's wider than what we presently have?
As a right-of-way, yes. But, you know, whenever I think about that right-of-way, I always think, well, a developer working, say, for example, adjacent to this road might very well be willing to give up some real estate in exchange for no density deduction in favor of a graceful sort of entry into the village. You know, I kind of think a roundabout that evolves into some kind of more gracious road that's more pedestrian friendly could be a nice thing. So that's Keene. I thought, and these are mostly just places I plucked them out, not because I was shopping around on Google or anything like that. It was more little towns I'd been in and sort of thought, okay, kind of fascinating.
Okay, so I think I skipped around.
So this is Rutland.
This one?
This is Rutland right here. So this is Route 7, you know. Man, in some stretches here, Route 7 is 4 to 6 lanes wide, you know, with not a whole lot of on-street parking on it. But, you know, the semblance of the fire station, I think, or is maybe right here, I think, with the apron over there. So this is one of the main intersections here that leads you to the actual downtown.
Right.
This is mostly residential, but there are some clerical buildings. There's a church across the street over here, but this is kind of a fairly intense, nicely little scaled town green, adjacent to Route 7. Then this is the thing that I'm always going on ad nauseum about is off of Route 7 here and off of this street. Now suddenly there's a secondary street, almost a kind of service street to Route 7, and there you have a swath that's probably at least 100 feet with a sidewalk and occasionally some parking down here, and then these structures here, which are a little bit like our village in some respects. You know, there's a law office on the first floor, residential stuff on the upper floors. They were mostly single-family houses. I think this is something more substantial. But you've in essence got this sort of secondary lane that enables you to kind of feel somewhat buffered from the way in which this road has developed. And I'd say, commercially, this might not be the best example of this kind of thing, but from a physical standpoint, where it kind of culminates in a sort of substantial green space, and then offers this as a kind of buffer for moving around. Not just as a buffer, it's also active. There's some gazebos and other stuff on that thing. And being back here is quite pleasant. And yet when you're on this road, you've got an awareness here. I'm not saying there's neon signs along here or anything like that, but it's sort of a fascinating space to analyze in more depth, I guess.
That's mostly residential.
There's some.
It's mixed.
Drove down there. And
Yeah.
There's more of a mix than I thought there was going to be. Let me put it that way. So maybe go to the next one, Alex.
All right.
That's Keene. All right. So this is Claremont, New Hampshire, and this is kind of an interesting. This has more to do with just an almost kind of gestural sort of green space. When I think of a shaped roundabout, they don't always have to be round. But as something that sort of encourages, on-street parking, this is not sort of, actually over here is kind of amorphous. But the kind of pedestrian linkages, and monument, and, sort of small little gathering space, I think these things in their scale can be kind of interesting. I think this is some kind of municipal building at the end, kind of situated where you'd hope it would be. You want to go to the next one? So much more modest in scale. This is Stratford, Vermont. This is one of the quintessential meeting houses in the state, probably 1788 or something. Again, playing a little bit with this kind of secondary road role, which is what this street is. You notice how close these houses are to that street. This is the main road coursing through town. These structures, just address that street in a much different kind of way. And, the little apron green space in front of, a civic monument of some kind. It's hard sometimes to extrapolate from this to sort of our town because it is such a rail through town. But I think some of these opportunities just require us maybe to stretch our minds a little bit. And
What's behind the houses on the bottom?
it's almost,
Looks like
these
a field.
Yeah, this is still
That's
agricultural
work.
land.
Yeah.
I
looks
think
like
it gets a little hillier on the uphill side. There's a lot of farmland still here.
Yep,
And then is there a river or?
Yes.
Yeah,
Above the very
is it
bottom?
the
right there in the,
Ottaquiche or it's not? No, there's some other. It's got a more complicated name. There's some great swimming holes on that stream. You want to go to the next one, Al? So this is Lyme, New Hampshire. Does some of the same and does it in a slightly more pronounced way. I mean, this is the main road running north-south along the Connecticut River, basically. I think this is a church with a little steeple. This is an inn down here. But again, main road, kind of going through town, the secondary lane. And these are mostly residential structures, for sure. There's a general store across the way over here where you see the parking. And this is the road to Thetford across the Connecticut. But, I would guess, most of these roads are, 30, 40 feet. So this
50 rod,
You know, it's probably 120, 140
50
feet. It's not,
yeah.
you know, and you've got a consciousness of, you know, when you're driving through of, you know, it's nicely landscaped. You can kind of, it's not a straight path. I like your description, Barb, you know, where you can kind of meander through this and there's random things going on in the landscape. It's still kind of soft. So
Now it's it.
that's it. Go back to that first one.
Yes.
Yeah. Mostly because, you know, I was talking with some friends of mine the other day, and I was saying to them, point to me, maybe I've said this to you guys as a sort of plaintive wail, but point to me in the state of Vermont, you know, a really good sort of adjunct development that's kind of glommed on in a graceful way to an existing village that's dearly loved, or town, or city. And, you know, you're hard pressed to come up with much of anything. I don't know. I didn't go on that walk through Williston. I've been there enough and sort of spent most of my time gagging, you know. And the same's true up in Colchester, whatever that development is up there at the corners, you know. A lot of it's the architecture, and the landscape hasn't really sort of come along. But this is one piece that when you look at it like this in a drawn form, I'm not quite as impressed with it. But when you're in it, this is Route 7, this is in Shelburne. You know, this is within walking distance of downtown Shelburne. And this is, you know, a collaborative group of developers. I think it's Housing Vermont, Cathedral Square. There's a mix of uses in here, Habitat for Humanity. My little thing is not, oh, there it is. So I think this is an elderly housing project. This is a certain amount of, you know, affordable housing, but also some market rate in there. There's some existing, Harrington's is right here, existing structures, there's a church down here. It's a sort of quiet little insertion, but done in a way, there's still an awful lot of parking, and even with it, this building has
There's
parking
some
beneath
parking
it,
under,
and so
yeah.
does this building. These are two Habitat for Humanity duplexes. You know, it's a kind of, you know, I think the little development that we have behind that one layer, what's it called over here? Green Street, you know, kind of goes in that direction a little bit. The architecture is not quite as pleasing, but, you know, as a little graceful wart, you know, glommed onto Shelburne Village, I really think this is a place to look. It's interesting to walk through there, you guys, and just sort of, and if all development were sort of done in this way, you know, with a mix of housing types, there isn't much in the way of commercial here, I grant. But, you know, it's within walking distance of sort of Shelburne Core and the shopping mall. You can actually, I think there's sort of a back way to get there, down this direction. It's really, I think from a scale standpoint, it's mostly 2 and 3 stories, but the third story is usually under the roof, dormered or something like that. I don't know.
Once the
It's a pretty
vegetation,
good
once the trees grow
project.
bigger, that'll change the quality of that space quite a bit, but it's quite good. I agree with everything you've said, Rob.
It's 100% residential. I mean, there's
Right,
no
it is
reason
all
for anyone
residential.
else in the community to ever go there unless they
It's true.
have someone they're visiting.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So it's not attached
There's a
in
builder's
that
office
sense.
over here somewhere, but he's not even part of the development. But nonetheless, it's worth just kind of walking through a little bit.
Yeah, I thought it was an excellent example of how you could build larger multi-story buildings for senior housing or what have you, and have them still blend
Yeah,
and not be
not dominate.
not dominate, not be shocking
Yeah.
to the eye.
Yeah.
Who's the developer? in this?
It's a collaborative. I mean, to some degree, you know, you probably most of you know this. I mean, even like BlackRock, you know, if they did something up here, it would be, you know, in all likelihood involve people like Cathedral Square. They may well be the developers of a senior housing project and that's what happened here. It was a collaboration of nonprofit housing developers. You know, 3 of them, Habitat for Humanity, Cathedral Square, I think, and
Champlain Housing Trust.
Champlain Housing
Housing
Trust.
Trust.
And with Housing Vermont sort of probably in the background helping with financing and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And then, I don't know who the developer was actually.
Who was the architect?
Well,
All-
that
all by-
always, this is Duncan Wisniewski.
Right,
you know,
all by the same architect, interestingly enough, and yet there's variety there among those buildings.
Yep.
that
No,
you
they
might
did
not
a great job.
expect.
And I only bring it up because I have such a hard time finding something, and I don't think I'm being overly critical. You know, something that you really say, this feels pretty good, you know, especially as a little bump.
Alex, before you do that, could you bring up just the village visualization?
Further this way,
Just a
quite a
little
ways
bit.
down, still a half a mile down the road.
You know where the stone church is, the beautiful little church? It's right next to that.
Oh, so I've been through there.
It's
and I was
really
never
behind
quite-
Right on, right on the
village that's
Yeah.
there, like the Shelburne
side.
Country Store.
If you're in the parking
Yeah.
lot behind the
Very
church,
well north of that,
you're,
yeah.
you're looking at the side
Yeah.
of it. But you gotta go out and come in a different road. There's not a connection.
Yeah, we went through it and I thought it was very phony.
You did?
And maybe once the trees grow, I'd be more impressed, but.
What struck you as phony?
The color, the way things were located. It seemed like it
What,
was
the
just plunked.
entrances?
No, the buildings.
Just the buildings
They were just,
themselves?
seemed to be just plunked here and one over there, and I didn't feel a connection between things,
Mm-hmm.
but it was still new, so,
Okay, it's interesting to
but
me.
seeing that here.
I wonder how
it's-
much landscaping has to do with that impression.
I think it
Yeah.
would have a great deal to do with
And
it.
20 years from now, you know,
Yeah.
would it?
It would be
Or even
wonderful.
5, you know, it takes a few years
Yeah.
to.
There's also,
Yeah,
you can
fill
do
out.
things with some of these residential, I don't, but I was down in South Carolina to visit my father-in-law, and he lives in it is land unit development, man, I mean, to the T. But the thing that's nice about it, it was all forest, and they didn't come in and just clear cut everything, build their stuff, and then plant trees. They kept large parts of these old growth trees, and it really makes it feel like parts of these neighborhoods where they've kept some of that has been there for 50 years, when it was just built maybe 10 years ago. And it was just really nice that they didn't save a little money by clear cutting and starting from nothing. They kept a lot of the old forest and the old growth
Or
moss
work it
trees and
in.
the old oaks around to keep that feeling. Anyway, I don't know if we can tell them, you know.
They
Of course,
need
most
to-
of the stuff
they
out
need
here
to-
is all
they
flat
need to
ag land.
plant- They need to fill that with woods.
Yes.
When the woods grow up,
Yeah.
then they can come back and do
Right.
something.
There you go.
Maggie, you wanted to see the village visualization project
Yeah, I have
deliverables. This was for people who are familiar with it. This was a project that the village steering committee took the lead on in 2012, and Mike Boucher, who was on that committee, sort of did the lion's share of the work. Mike lives in town, but he's also a landscape architect. He owns the company T.J. Boyle and Associates. And so they did an awful lot of work to try to visualize or present a visualization of what the Village Northwest particularly could look like if it were built out at the maximum density. And as I think I told you at a past meeting, or maybe it was the DRB I was telling this to, currently the regs do actually encourage developers to build to that maximum density. So there was a desire to show, well, what might that look like? I won't go over all the ins and outs of how they did the project. It wasn't just a computer exercise. We talked to developers. We had some meetings. There were roundtable discussions, that sort of thing.
I just wanted to bring it up because there's a lot of this that I'm not a fan of. But the one thing that I've gone back to and I find myself really drawn to is that buffer.
Right. So to orient everyone, this is Shelburne Falls Road. This is Route 116. And this right here is Riggs Road. And
that's the Riggs farmhouse just above it.
right here,
Yes,
yeah.
that was kept.
So everything else, is an ag field and doesn't exist. What you see here doesn't exist, but that gives you some, frame of reference.
So what you have is the negative of it is that we're adding yet more impervious surface with the secondary road. But on the other hand, especially if you have an easy in and out, it sort of takes the pressure off the the parking is easy, traffic is very slow on the secondary. There's a very nice buffer for pedestrians. Anyway,
Right, you were particularly intrigued by this green belt.
yes, yeah.
Through
and
here.
and there are destinations, the green in the middle, the green swath up above.
Yeah, there was also a real concerted effort. I think the play fields in the back there were, and you know, it was a kind of crude assumption about water retention, and there was a fair number of, what do you call those, sort of retention ponds off to the west there.
Yeah.
But we also really tried to link that green space along 116 back with that, so you could kind of meander through there.
Plus you
And-
have it down on the south side too.
Well, that's along the La Platte, and then there's that, there's the La Platte down there, and
Well,
whatever-
the Platte's over here. This is Patrick,
Patrick Brook,
down
I'm
here,
sorry,
yeah.
yeah. And then the upper little water course that comes near the corner of 116 is that other
Down
swath
through
through
there.
there.
We did have roundabouts in it too originally.
Yeah, I
Remember
think
that?
we had a
Those
roundabout,
2 squares were roundabouts.
yeah,
I think.
possibly, yeah.
And just so you're aware is when BlackRock gave its presentation, we actually, the village steering committee requested some of these things put in it. Particularly the I don't know, you can point to it, but the buffer. I remember we wrote a letter saying, you know, this should be incorporated in their plan, and kind of this turnoff road was kind of a nice thing, and that actually got denied by the DRB because our zoning regs won't let you do that today.
Well, not the green buffer. That's perfectly consistent
but
with
that-
the,
The side road.
but the
in and out
the
sort of-
slip lane to get
yeah.
into it was
But the buffer got killed because of the side road. You couldn't, it was considered parking in the front of a building. And that got axed. I remember that, because that was a big,
Well, that's
Thing
what I
we
was
were-
wondering about.
That's what you would perceive as you drove down
Well, yeah.
116. You would be looking at parking in front of those buildings
'Cause we
over
did-
that park.
yeah, we did talk to him. I remember we sat with BlackRock years and years ago, and we mentioned that was an important factor, and they were all for it, but then when we went to the DRB, that lane was front.
The specific
parking.
problem was not that there would be a lane with parking on it, because on-street parking is allowed and doesn't count as front yard parking. The problem was the Riggs property.
Yeah.
And the fact that they don't control that, and so their lane would be a parking lot. It wouldn't be a connecting road. It would end right there.
Oh, I knew it was something about it being a parking lot.
In the first incantation of this, they had to end that lane because they didn't own the property south, and so it was a parking lot in front of these buildings, and that's why it didn't meet the design standard. If it had been able to continue through, if they were able to gain a control or ownership of the Riggs property, I think you're right. I think they would have been very amenable to having this be a frontage road like this, not unlike the ones that Rolf was showing before. But that ownership in holding, we keep calling it the Riggs property. It's not the Riggs property. It's the Bouger
Brian
property.
Bouger.
Brian and Kathy own it, but used to be the Riggs property. In any
Okay,
case,
thanks for correcting me then.
I can show you a couple. Well, I remember because I argued with you about it. Let's see. I think there's some simulated. I mean, if you really want to watch a little animated video, Mike's office did an awful lot of work on this. They have a 5-minute little animation that flies you through the whole thing. It's kind of fun, but this gives you some sense of what it looks like from various angles.
Focus on that lower left image. All
right.
I mean, that's basically, you know, you're flying in your drone above 116 there. So that's the Riggs farmhouse right there, or Brian Bouger's farmhouse, and then that's that little lane that kind of. But
Right.
you know, these are mostly, you know.
This was the connecting.
ordinary two
This is the
structures.
Route 116 green area. This is that connecting central green, and the rec fields are back there somewhere. It's interesting. I think that some of the reactions to this were any green elements were not what was observed. Most people were seeing vast quantities of building, like this.
And paved surfaces.
And, yeah, and 3-story buildings, which made it difficult to sort of wrap your head around this still being Hinesburg, because it looks a little different. At least some of them do. In any case, there's lots of material in the village visualization. If anybody's interested in seeing more of it, I can make it available. The animation is a very large file. It's difficult to share, but you can come to the office, or I can bring it to you.
More attractive than Finney Crossing.
Well, those buildings are just so large, some of them. I mean, they're massive. They're entire blocks. Yeah. There.
Well, there's some of those types in here.
They all look the same, too.
Was that in a little booklet, Alex?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna hit the lights.
So where do we go from here?
Well, so I'll just remind you where we started with this, and you can go wherever you want with it. You're in charge. But when you spoke with the select board about interim zoning and said, let's stop everything for a little while so we can get our act together, the conversation was, we would like to refine the zoning, especially the design standards, so that the community can have a little bit more predictability and faith in what is going to come and what would be allowed and what it would sort of look and feel and work like. You talked about fine tuning of the zoning as opposed to turning off a district and saying, well, we're no longer gonna do any development around NRG. That's just done, or Village Northwest. So walking into this effort, my assumption was you were still on that wavelength, that we're looking to do a number of things with village rezoning. You want definitions of mixed use, you want an update of the official map, you want to take a second look at these density bonuses and base density allowances and tinker with those, and you want to have more prescriptive design standards. If you want to do more than that, we can do that. I think if you want to do more than that, then what John said is prescient. We should take it slow, because those would be big changes to say, well, we have now decided that the Village Northwest, for example, is no longer going to be developed, at least not for the next 20 years, because we're going to focus internally just within the area between Commerce Street and Mechanicsville Road, and really incentivize infill and redevelopment of that. If you're looking to do the tinkering with the design standards, we will talk a lot more. But I'd like to start giving you examples from from our other communities and of how they have defined, how development should work, and remind you of the design standards that we have right now in the regs, some of which came from some of our surrounding communities where we talk about, steeply pitched roofs and orientation of buildings and parking and that sort of thing. So I'm looking for guidance from you on the policy side of, how much of this do you want to reinvent and how much of this do you want to hone of what we have today? Because we're not starting from nothing. We do have a vision, we have design standards, we have districts, we have all these things which have yielded actual development proposals that we're all, pretty familiar with.
So one of my concerns is, I don't have an issue with the density that we ask for today, but I do know there's been a lot of feedback from people about the density from the community, right? Just having seen the different proposals that have gone through the DRB and things like that. And is that something that we need to think about? Or do we have a vision that we're going to, because I'm fine with the densities that we describe and how that looks. And I think it's a good plan, but I also want to be cognizant that other folks in the town, have different opinions on that. And do we need to think about that?
I think it'd be really good, Alex, on the density question, in these different parts of town, you were able to sort of, I know we could go read the regulations, goes without saying, but I think a summary of the sort of approach to density that is in play right now, along with all the bonuses and how that all plays out currently, and have that summation up on the wall like this, would be a really good piece of education for all of us.
Okay.
Now, some of us don't need it. I do need it. So maybe that's why I'm talking about it. But I think to understand where we are right now would really be a good first step in doing what Jeff's talking about. I don't know whether I have a problem with it. I think another thing that
Well, you did see the village visualization study. You were on the committee
but
that helped
even
make it
that,
happen.
I sort of, this is 10 years ago now, for heaven's sake. I think another thing that I don't ever see in any of these development proposals, and Andrea, I think, alluded to it to some degree. I mean, even though I wasn't a landscape architect or a planner in school, even we did all sorts of let's say, land analysis. I'm watching what some sons of, or daughters of friends right now who are in landscape school are doing, insofar as just trying to understand the terrain, the character of the terrain. John talked about it, the sort of whole essence of the land, and what is it saying to us insofar as how it wants to be used. I don't mean to sound mystical, but in any of these development proposals that we've seen, I'm not saying they're not trying hard, but I've never seen, say, for example, a really thorough resource analysis, and I'm talking about water, soil character, geology. I mean, just a real comprehensive understanding of what they're going to be placing all these structures on and what the rationale for that placement is.
So that was done. We do have a good example of that.
Do we?
It is, so you have three big projects, right, that we often think about that are all stuck in limbo because of our lack of infrastructure. The project around NRG that Jan Blomstrom owns and worked on, they did that. And I think I could show you,
That
I
would
could
be a
provide
great
you
thing for us to see.
their sketch plan materials where they walked through all of those things and looked at soils and wetlands and slopes and how good a job they did in
Okay.
integrating all that is a
Yeah.
different question, but they did go through that exercise. And I don't know if any of you were involved. I know that, I think you were, John. They invited members of the community in during their early development, way before they applied, to the Development Review Board to sort of be part of those conversations. It was a pretty interesting collaborative process, I thought. So I'd be happy to walk you through that.
I think it would be a good thing because
And
I think
it's most of that district. It's that.
well, for
property is
us
the
to
Village Northeast
understand
District.
that, and for us to also perhaps participate in some kind of prescriptive requirements that really mandate that prospective users of this land, they're really just borrowing it, adhere to, and I think that would be an interesting and worthwhile set of criteria to.
It's
They need
interesting to note too that project did not propose anywhere near the density that the zoning
permissible.
was allowed for. And
Yeah.
part of the calculus was they didn't feel like the land could support it. The other part of the calculus was they weren't so interested in doing, larger multifamily dwellings. Most of the residential that they proposed were single-family duplex style housing.
Yeah, I think they were focused on like having teachers and stuff that work at CVU could afford a house. I think that was something
Perhaps
that
they had a senior housing
something along
element as
those
well,
lines.
but
Yeah, they're trying to keep
unlike the
people here
BlackRock
working here.
project across the street, which has 10-plex apartment houses and larger scale townhouse conglomerations, they didn't have that. But
And did not do the kind of analysis of the land that the folks for NRG did.
well, it's interesting
Not that I've seen.
because the Village Visualization Project at least presented information on those. So I can provide you with the booklet they produced where they looked at the Village Northwest District and they went through the various physical characteristics of it. Again, how well those were actually integrated into the development plan versus the fact that they presented them and said they looked at them is a different question, but there was some of that done. it's hard to poke holes, but I don't think it was done as well as the
wasn't.
project across the street.
It wasn't.
I think Jan's project was more intensive in that regard.
Could I make a comment about that, kind of on this line, is that what Joe said about the stormwater and it ties into doing that kind of site analysis, is that, you know, these developments will get their permits from the state, but it doesn't mean that those permits are going to not contribute to degradation of Patrick Brook primarily. Because the design standards, you know, it's the cumulative effect of these, and they're just putting the detention ponds in places where it doesn't really interfere with the layout of kind of the where they want the neighborhoods, and it works from a gravity standpoint. But there may be soils on that large area, if we're talking about that are much better suited for groundwater infiltration.
Right.
And things like that. And so I think it's really important to, and just as in the NRG proposal, they didn't build out to the maximum density because they were more sensitive to the topography that was there. It was a little bit more challenging. It's a little more hilly on the east side of the road. But they were, you know, I think sensitive to the wetlands and the way in which the land worked. And I think on the BlackRock proposal, it's really just, it's pretty much treating it as a flat area.
Right.
You know, it's not really being sensitive to the subtle changes and the view that we all appreciate at that high knob, you know, the high point on 116 and looking over. So I just want to emphasize the importance of looking at those soils and how the groundwater is functioning on those, and not be lulled into believing that just because they're getting their state stormwater permits, that it's not going to impact us as taxpayers when Patrick Brook becomes stormwater impaired. Because the permits are not designed to keep the water from becoming impaired. And it's kind of a disconnect. It's just, you know, it's a certain standard that they can do it, but, you know, there's lots of ways in which they can become impaired. And that's not the purpose of the stormwater regulations.
I agree with everything you just said.
The third thing that I was considering, I mean, and I'm not sure whether other, you know, Maggie looked into this a little bit. It's sort of understanding what we've got to some degree. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about mixed use and its importance and so forth. I'm just sort of curious, you know, what the current, and I think we have this information, whether we all are familiar with it, another issue is kind of, you know, if you take the village growth area, you know, what is sort of the percentage of retail, commercial office, you know, various kinds of non-residential uses? And do we have, you know, we have a reasonably good understanding of what that ratio is.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that some when we did the inventory that Maggie helped spearhead, and yeah.
Think it's useful?
My concern is, we've done this exercise, and I'm concerned, again, I've said this before, but that we're going to sort of repeat conversations that we've had before, and sort of have rambling conversations for several meetings and never really get anywhere. So I think it's really important for us to have goals, as you said before, to have specific goals as to what we want our outcomes to be, you know? Because this could go on for 6 to 8 months. We meet twice a month for 2 hours a night. We meet for 4 hours a month. That's it. And so that's not a lot of time to get things done. And if we want to have new design standards in place for future development projects, we really need to focus ourselves. I mean, is that what we want? If we do, I think we need to have some pretty specific goals in mind. The conversations are fascinating, and I think looking at existing data is really helpful. But we really need to have goals in mind, so that we don't just talk and talk and talk and never really do anything, which I think we've kind of done before, because we've had these conversations about mixed use and density, and I don't think I don't think anything has come from those discussions. So when we talk about design standards, what do we mean? I mean, what was this about? When we look at what each of us chose as what's important, what does that come down to?
Yeah, so when I mean, I think it's probably worth reflecting outside of the meeting, especially me, because it takes me a while to absorb everything that you're saying as a group. But some of the things that I saw was that we're going to continue to have design standards that encourage or maybe start to require on-street parking. We don't actually require it now. We simply encourage it and say it's great. And that we want to have these streets that are slowing traffic and allowing for safe pedestrian use. That's actually nothing new, but I think we need design standards that are
Around 116,
more specific
basically,
about that. I think that this concept of the green, the linear green along 116 is something that we could flesh out in design standards more. That's why I was trying to push you in terms of, in that section of 116 north of Patrick Brook, what are we doing there? Because we have some existing design standards that we could bolster, or we could throw them out and have an entirely new vision for that. I think that this concept of the concentrated retail block that you brought up, Maggie, and Rolf, that you are advocating happen in that sort of underutilized section of 116 on the east side between Commerce and Mechanicsville Road, that there might be an opportunity to write design standards specific to that area, so that when it does get redeveloped, there is a requirement for multi-story buildings, for example. Where I wanted to go with the green elements was something that Rolf has been saying for a while, is that they seem to be, and I think others have mentioned it too, that in developments, they often seem to be the leftover spaces around the peripheries. And actually in the village visualization, I had, I don't know if I can pull it back up, I had Mike Boucher do an image showing all the impervious surface in one image and all the green areas in the other image. Let's see if I can find it here. So these are the buildings. Whoops. There are the buildings in that district in the visualization. There are all the impervious surfaces, non-building impervious surfaces, it looks like. There's the green space, and
That's
this,
a common green space, that's not what
well, in this,
includes what's around the building.
well, right,
Right
it's
up against them.
sort of more substantial green space, and it's these the linear green, the center green, and these peripheral sort of waterway green areas. And I guess where I was going with that is that I got the impression from Rolf's comment in the past and others that we want more specificity about how green spaces, smaller green spaces, work within these more densely settled portions of the development plan. so that we get something that's less Finney Crossing and more rural Hinesburg version of a higher density development, because there's more green space integrated into the interior and not just set aside in large blocks, you know, in certain areas, some of which are peripheral. So, you know, I think we could think of some design standards about that element. I don't have it in my head how to write that yet, but I'd be interested in taking a crack at it.
And then another, I don't know, theme that I'm seeing is, I don't know, character or architectural styles or
Right, well,
what we don't want.
your suggestion about an outcome which talked about no cookie cutter house plans and faux details, but to have variation in architectural style. Again, I'm not sure how to write that into a regulation, but it seems like something that everyone keeps talking about and is interested in, so maybe there's a way.
Could you do something along the lines of, you know, you need so many architectural designs by how big your development is or something? I don't know. So when
In terms of variety?
Yeah, so like when I said no cookie cutter, to me what I was thinking is I took the two. I took Thistle Hill and I took the name, you know, the other development down here by Kenny Drive. Creekside. So I looked at those two, right? Because they're both, you know,
Large
planned
developments that happen all at the same time,
right?
yep.
Talk mixed use, but they're pretty much residential, right? So when I walk down through Creekside, I like it. I mean, it's pleasant. You got trees and everything. But when I look at the houses there, I pretty much see one, you know, you got Plan A, and then Plan B is Plan A reversed, and then Plan A and B connected. And I just feel like it's the same.
There's more. I
know,
think
there's more
there
now,
were
but you know what I
actually
mean?
4 designs, and they get flipped and reversed. But I agree, and we know what else I see. I think I mentioned this in another
Yeah.
meeting. All the building heights are the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Uniform building
Maybe that
heights.
was what's more it is, because when I go to Thistle Hill, it's still, you can tell it's a planned community, right? There's so many selections. But if you look at it and you're walking around, you've got smaller single story, maybe 2-bedroom, 1-bath, cheaper ones, and then right next to it might be a bigger 2-3 story house that's bigger. So you've got that varying differences. It doesn't seem so.
But the
You know.
land is very different, Jeff, there.
Yeah,
So
it's-
That's why I think
That helps. Yeah, it helps
Yeah.
it be a little
it
more
was pretty
diverse.
much flat over here.
It's about as flat
but-
as you can get
But it
along
is
Farmville
all,
Drive.
I think it really is onto something though.
No,
Even
true.
And I think
No, it's true.
the part of the issue is that there's very little opportunity for those houses to change over time. Whereas when you look at all the houses in South Burlington that were built in the 50s and 60s,
Right.
and they probably all were almost exactly the same, but there was enough land or the zoning allowed it that they could become 2-story houses.
Well, and part of it was that they were just smaller.
Right, to
They
start,
had room to
probably.
expand because they started as ranches and smaller homes, whereas
Right.
today the homes seem to be built as big as they will ever be.
Yeah.
Nobody starts with these small
Right.
homes anymore.
And these out here are all just on slabs too.
Right.
No foundations.
But I guess that's my point, is how do we break that up, you know? So 20 years, you know, because you can go through development, you know, neighborhoods today, and it's all, you could just look and you're like, this was built in 1970, you know, or this was built in 1940, or this was built in, you know, how do we make sure that
Well, I
doesn't
don't think you're ever going to get away from that, right? Because building materials change over time and they're consistent
Yeah.
within a block of time. But what I think we can get away from is the monotone flavor
Yeah.
within a given set of building materials. So yeah, they're going to have vinyl siding or cement board siding. And it might be clapboard, but it's still going to be of that material. But we can, right now, we don't have a design standard that A, requires multi-story buildings, or B, requires varying heights of buildings. Or,
Square footage.
yeah, square footage, or Rolf and John would be better able to talk about some of the
Well, I
architectural,
I get really
standards.
nervous when people start having this conversation.
Okay, so.
And I get nervous because I've been to homogeneous neighborhoods. You know, I have a kid going to school in Austin, Texas, and there are craftsman-style houses, chock-a-block full in a neighborhood, that are virtually all the same, or some recipe, that's very, very similar. And most of those houses were built, 1920, something like that. The landscape has matured. There are big trees. There's a nice pedestrian pattern through these neighborhoods. I don't care that these houses are all the same and using the same materials and are pretty much the same height. There's some undulation.
They're different colors because people can actually paint them.
Yeah, they can paint them, but
They can
you
put
know.
additions to the
I
side,
think the
which
most
you can't
important
do
thing
with-
is that we increase funding for art education in our schools so people aren't accepting of such banal crap. You
Okay,
know?
I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna jump in for
You
two
know.
reasons. Number one, it's really so close to my bedtime. Two, I think, I've got like basically 116 parking. How we address that. That's one of our topics, and green space, and architecture. Does that sound like a place to start?
Well, I think you're on the right track, Maggie, as far as just urging us to move more quickly and.
Well,
Yeah,
the problem is it's also interesting that we could just sit here hour after
Yeah.
hour and do that, which I'd love to do, but I can't. So
Maggie, I would like to suggest, and you said you would be interested in working together with me to look at some kind of simple illustration of all of these ideas put together
Sure,
over
we
the
can
entire
do that for
village
the-
area.
yeah, for the
And
fourth.
we do that outside of this meeting. You and I get together and work that out and bring that to the next meeting.
I might collaborate with Alex on that as two of you, just because.
Well, he knows so much about
I'd love to
what's
see these
happening.
green dots translate into sort of
right,
at
But,
least the beginnings of an action.
yeah, because just the exercise of
plan.
all of us sitting at home and thinking about places we've been and what we want our town to look like, I think was a really really healthy exercise. So, but anyway, it's 4 minutes to bedtime, so.
It's time.
Okay, so next, what I'm hearing is I'm gonna bring back some kind of a summary of the dot exercise. I'm gonna attempt to give Ralph the density summary, and,
Well, if I'm the only one, don't bother.
okay, is he the
If
only one?
everybody else understands it, just fine.
I don't understand it.
No, I think that
I
would be
don't even
helpful.
begin to understand it, but I'm new.
Okay, so I'll work on that, and then, and then I'm gonna hold on giving you actual design standards for just one more meeting.
I think
Yeah.
it's premature to do it now.
Okay.
Right away. And the third thing you're gonna do is also talk with
Right,
Maggie and
work
I
with you two
about
on-
some kind of big picture in simple language.
Let's talk, because I still don't understand what
Right,
you're
I
talking about.
know you don't
but
understand that
You
yet.
can explain it to me.
Right. Maggie doesn't understand it either.
I understand it either.
Should we hold minutes for the next meeting?
Unless you think they're urgent, Mr. Chair.
If everybody thought they were fantastic, you could
They
just
were amazing.
approve
They
them.
were just amazing, and I wasn't here, so it doesn't really,
Me either.
but they were still.
So we just accept the minutes as written.
Motion for that?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Can we go through any other business, Alex?
Just briefly, Hannaford is being reviewed on April 17th, or at least that's when it starts with the DRB. Hopefully you all know that from the various Front Porch Forum posts. Town council got back to us and said Hannaford's contention was incorrect, that in fact we should be using today's regulations to review these two applications, not the regulations when they first applied. So that's different from what the initial thought was, at least from the applicant. But the attorney did agree that the review should be limited in its scope to just the elements that are unsettled from the various court actions. So we will be talking principally about stormwater, traffic, and the setback change and any other things that are sort of tied to those. The Affordable Housing Committee commissioned an update to the housing needs assessment. That's now complete. I still need to get it to our webmaster to go up on the website, but if anybody's interested, I'm happy to forward it along. It largely reiterated the conclusions from the last housing needs assessment from 2010. But I think the most interesting point was that it reiterated a lot of that stuff. We need senior housing, we need more affordable housing. But what it said was, hey, you know that amazing, big affordable housing project, the first that Heinsberg ever seen over on Green Street that created 23 perpetually affordable houses? You need another one of those. That didn't really touch the need for that sort of housing. So some point town needs to partner again with a nonprofit and get something like that to happen. I've been trying to meet with various committees on implementing the town plan. I haven't met with too many yet, but the Affordable Housing Committee, the Conservation Commission, meeting with the Trails Committee coming up. So I'll keep you apprised. Just reminding them of what they're supposed to be doing and encouraging them to work on it. Got some correspondence from the Lewis Creek Association. I don't know if you remember, they, in coordination with a variety of other groups, have hosted a series of Water Matters.
Responsible Growth Heinsberg in particular.
In particular, that group, but also I think the Regional Planning Commission was involved in one.
Yes, they were.
Lake Iroquois Association. In any case, there have been 4, I guess, because they're doing part 5 on April 12th, which is the day after your first April meeting, and it's a Thursday. And the topic for this one, I think, is very relevant to what you're talking about right now and to some of the priorities that you expressed for in the town plan. So they'll be talking about village land use strategies to try to avoid what Andrea was talking about, polluted waterways that will increase taxes because we suddenly have to make major investments. And so Jessica Luiso from Milo McBroom will be here to talk about some of the studies that we've had them do in the village, that we've talked to you about over the years. And she'll be talking about the village's capacity to enhance natural and built stormwater treatment areas in order to allow for this build out that we're talking about. So it's really linked. She's also, in addition to having done work for us before and being a professional in that field, she is the chair of the South Burlington Planning Commission. So she's very in step with the kinds of conversations that you have. And so I'm excited to listen to what she has to say. Joe Colangelo, our former town administrator, who's now the town manager in Shelburne, is going to come and talk about why Shelburne is now facing, I think, what was described as a $7 million fix to fix stormwater-related problems that they were not aware of until some sampling had been done in a stream, and all of a sudden, oops, I guess it was worse than we thought. And so Joe will be talking about, the Shelburne experience and hopefully giving us some tips on how we can try to avoid that in Heinsberg. And they have some other speakers from the Lake Iroquois Association and Lewis Creek Association talking about water quality sampling.
Shannon Kelly.
Yeah, Shannon Kelly and Krista Hofsis. So Marty Illick from Lewis Creek Association contacted me just the other day and said, hey, we're doing this. It's a month away. Just wanted you to know, and if this agenda is draft, do you have any suggestions? I replied and said, this looks really relevant. I'd love to come. I don't know that I can present, but I'd love to be there to help be part of the conversation. I said the Planning Commission might like to be a sponsor. It'd be nice if there were a town committee here that were sponsoring. So I said I would ask you if you were interested in sponsoring. Sponsoring means putting your name. It doesn't mean money or anything. But I did tell her that, it looks like it's sponsored by a number of other groups, so I didn't know how you felt about joining in with Responsible Growth Heinsberg and VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and the Lake Iroquois Association and Lewis Creek Association. So.
As long as you don't have to bake cookies or anything,
I'm good.
So when is it again? April?
It's April 12th, from 7 to 9. Actually, one of the ideas I floated to Marty that I said I'd mention to you is you have a meeting the night before. I know you want to make progress on design standards and everything. So to to not have your meeting on that Wednesday and just meet on Thursday so that you can all come to this.
Where is it gonna be?
It's here.
Here.
You know, is you might not be enthusiastic about that, but that's the idea I floated to her. Is like maybe you could change this meeting to Wednesday the 11th, and the planning commission could sort of host it, or maybe the planning commission could reschedule your meeting on the 11th to be on the 12th and just attend this.
They've got commitments from
Various speakers,
various speakers, which would be,
difficult to reschedule.
yeah.
Yeah, I figured as much. Marty didn't get back to me on that question of
No, they're-
rescheduling this meeting, but
Well, it sounds like you got lots to do, too, just,
do both.
yeah.
Alex?
Yeah, I like merging the two together.
Okay.
Yeah, I
do.
I will
think
personally
it's worth us
encourage
going
all
to
of
it.
us to go,
And I think
any
that's
of
gonna
us
get
that
more
can
All right, then.
to go.
2 days in a row.
Please do, Ron.
We should all try to be there.
I just sit at home and watch bad TV, but okay.
I'm sorry, I'll be in Mexico, so I can't go.
Well,
So,
shucks.
so what I'm hearing is you would like to sponsor and you're willing to consider moving your April meeting.
Yep.
You can.
Sure.
Yes.
The 12th?
And I move we adjourn.
Okay.
Thank you.